My name is Jason Drinen, and I'm the practice lead at a company called ExpressAbility. We're a decision services partner. I've been working with decisions since around 2012 or so, and it's always been very drawn to this platform. I can't seem to get away from it. And we've really been on a mission to help organizations get the most that they can out of decisions. Can you adjust that? Yes. We probably have a little bit, some differing experience levels with decisions. So if I could ask this, just so I can tailor today to what would really benefit you the most. If you are new to decisions, you're really getting started with it. Could you show me your hand? Awesome, you're just getting started with it, okay. So if you have been developing with decisions for a while, you consider yourself pretty advanced in your techniques, you've been using it for a while, would you mind showing me your hand? Yeah, great. It's about half and half, really, I mean, roughly. So maybe even a few more advanced users. That's great. Either way, I really wanted you to walk out today with some nuggets, with some things that'll help you out, whether you've been doing it a long time or you're just getting started. Now, you've maybe heard it said before that the flexible shall not be broken, right? And if you're expected to solve business problems for a living, it doesn't take long to realize that a lot of problems are messy. Life's messy. Things don't fit in nice little clean boxes, right, a lot of the time. And we always like it when it does, but it's becoming more and more rare, it seems like, right? I will say this, there are a lot of workflow products on the market. Ooh, I can say things like that. I don't have the decisions logo. There are lots of products on the market. But I will say this, as an outsider, decisions just always shines in its versatility. And with that versatility, with that flexibility, yes, it does bring some complexity, does it not? It does. So I'm going to talk to you today about driven design. And we're going to look at the what, how, and the when. I think it's a good way to break it down today. We're going to start off, we're going to talk about what in the world is data-driven design and how is it different than a more static approach. We're going to talk about how would you practically implement something like this design construct. I'm going to talk through, in the Decisions platform, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks, some ways you can leverage the platform to achieve this. And I'm going to say this, when would you want to use it? Let's look at some scenarios, some case studies. We're going to look at some specific real-life case studies where this type of design pattern has worked really well for us. All right? So we start off here. What is data-driven design? And really, I mean, you could define it lots of different ways. We're going to define it a certain way for today's discussion. For today's discussion, let's call it this. This is the ability for a process flow to be defined by data points instead of a static arrangement. Okay? Think about this. A standard flow chart is like a static arrangement. Very static. A statically defined process is like a well-paved road, right? User submits a request, department A reviews the request, department B reviews the request, and then you might have some variable in there. If this, then department C reviews the request, right? This is very static. It's a defined order of operations, is what it is. Every single process that flows down this pathway will go this exact route. Will it not? It'll go this exact route. Even with the idea that there's some dynamic pieces to it, it's still very static. Now, have you ever wondered this? Have you ever wondered what if the order of these operations could be dynamic instead of static? What if, in other words, what if in regards to the order of certain events in your process, could the order be directed in some other way? Instead of just simply connecting them end to end in a predefined pattern. We get very accustomed to the beauty of the classic flow designer, right? Drag and drop, connect the things, right? But what if the order of this operations could be dynamic? I'll tell you this, if it was dictated by data instead of statically defined, you could create very highly adaptable processes that could even be changed by people, get this, by people who do not have Studio Tab access. Ooh, that could get interesting, couldn't it? That's right. So people without designer access could actually determine how your flow runs, how a process runs. That means a standard business user could truly administrate the way that a process runs. Now, data-driven processes are a lot like football games. You know, you have, before each play, you have the head coach, the assistant coach, the quarterback possibly, deciding on a play to use. I mean, it should be that their decision is based on the dynamics of the current game situation, right? Some would argue at times, maybe not, but it should be that way. And the choice is very dynamic. The choice is very dynamic depending on the situation at hand. Let's say this, a play in this scenario is a predefined set of instructions, is it not? It's truly a plan that has been made in advance, you would say. You know, let's call it a subflow for today. How about that? We'll call a play a subflow for today. And if you think about it, really, a game or a flow is really composed of a string of these dynamically chosen plays. Is that fair? Wouldn't you say? Yeah, or subflows. So to better illustrate the need for really a data-driven design, I want to get really practical about the people who do the work. It helps us dig into this need a little bit and understand where it's best used. You think about the player. We're going to talk about the players. You know, you think about them in a nutshell. And I'm just mentioning a few of them here, of course, and this is an end-to-end solution, you know, standing up a solution like this. You have developers involved, they have their Studio Tab access, you know, they're in the designers, they're building the solution. We'll call them the Studio Tab people. Then we have the process admins. This is an interesting set of people right here, very interesting. These people are really involved in the steady state management of an application from day to day. They have usually just portal access. They have access to dashboards, they have administrative actions, things like that. And then we have standard run-of-the-mill end users. Let's call them the consumers. So these process admins, let's call them the day-to-day people. I want to zoom in on just them for a second. This is an interesting group. They play a very special role. And you know, day in and day out, they're watching, say, requests roll in, for instance. Sometimes they're intervening in certain circumstances, right? You know, Susie is out, and we forgot to set up impersonation for her, and we need someone else to approve a request. You know, can Randy, can he review the request? So maybe they're editing assignments. Maybe a process admin is doing something like that. Maybe you call a process admin something else where you're at, but I think you get the idea. And you know, they may make adjustments, you know, to a process. Here's what's interesting about them that we find is they're very familiar with the whole process. They are usually focused on a discipline of some kind. You know, they aren't typically very technical, but they might be in accounting or HR. And they know their domain extremely well. They understand the business process from end to end. They're truly process admins in every sense of the term. Now, oftentimes, a design like this, a data-driven design, manifests because of this advanced functionality that a process admin needs to do their job, to do their work. You find this a lot. Because they're not very technical, but they know their business area very well, right? You would not give them access to the Studio Tab. You would not give them access to designers. You wouldn't teach them to use decisions necessarily. They're just not very technical, and they don't want to know that stuff, frankly. But they really know their domain. But they have a need to adjust how a process runs, the how part of how the process runs. And what do you do with a situation like that? when you need to give someone the ability to control flow execution, but the intended audience just shouldn't have designer rights, doesn't make sense. And it wouldn't be appropriate to give them to them. Here enters the amazing flexibility of decisions. So what kind of design pattern would you want to use in decisions to implement this type of design? So let's do this. Let's break it out into 3 big picture parts. Let's call it a 3-piece design pattern that makes up a data-driven design construct. It gives flow execution control to process admins. How do we do it? We start off with an execution engine flow. Imagine a flow whose job is to call flows. That's what this is. A flow whose job is to call flows. We then have directive data, which feeds the execution engine to tell it what flows to run and in what order and in what way, inputs, etc. Let's call this the instructions. And then finally, the third leg of the stool, the management of directive data, or the configuration. You can expose interfaces that allow process admins to configure the data, right? To actually configure the data that tells the execution engine, all right, what to do, the configuration. How interesting. With those 3 elements in place, I mean, you have the potential to make a hyper-dynamic, an application where process admins can truly change, manage in real time how a process runs, the details of how their process runs. Let's put it all together this way. So process admins are using interfaces to, it's a little bit light. Our brightness is kind of high on this projector, but so you probably can't see all of it, but these are blown up later. I have bigger pictures of these later. But the configuration itself is where process admins are using interfaces to manage how processes is run, which then in turn changes the directive data in the database. You see where I'm going with this? And then the execution engine uses that directive data to decide what flows to run. So you see how it all fits together? Imagine the possibilities. You can give process admins full configuration interfaces where they can administrate details however needed. They can, bypass the need to burden a flow developer to make changes to their process, right? For tweaks, for changes to how the thing works. It's a way to be hyper agile. It's a way to align with a very fast changing business. It works really good for validation processes. And I will say this, it can be built with guardrails, because let's face it, some process admins might need some guardrails to keep themselves from getting into too much trouble, right? You could build it that way, because you're controlling how they control the process as well. Now, we have truly, using this approach, you can truly bridge the gap between, business know-how, business knowledge, and technical acumen. You bridge the gap between the two. So, of course, this type of situation is not appropriate for every single, this design is not appropriate for every single situation. But I will say, they really do emerge. And you need to consider those hyper-fluid processes where domain experts need to quickly adapt and adjust to just rapidly changing needs of the business. It gives you one more tool in your tool belt, right? After all, there's a room here full of problem solvers. We're all problem solvers. And flexibility and adaptability are key. This level of this level of flexibility in design is not available in every workflow solution, let me tell you that. But Decisions is very unique in the way that it's built to allow us to do things like this. It puts it in a very unique position, I would say. So if you want to do something like this, how would you achieve it in Decisions? I want to give you today a few tips and tricks in the platform to help you walk out with some tangible tools that you could use to achieve something like this. So let's start off talking about the building blocks. So you would think about this as a developer. You would build out a set of flows that compose a library of flows. And this is a set of flows that are specifically tailored to be items that are selectable and stackable by your process admins to achieve just a wide range of desirable business outcomes. Think about this, each discrete flow is a module or a discrete set of functionality, and you end up with a library of plays that the process admin can arrange in their game, right? That's the name of the game. Now, depending on your business scenario, you may need to standardize these flows, their particular inputs and outputs. They may need to have very standardized inputs and outputs so that, every flow in your library is structured the exact same way in this library. So that when the execution engine goes to run it, it can handle certain outcomes differently than others, but it always knows what to expect. It knows what to feed it, and it knows what to expect in return. Now, it may also be necessary for the database to house these static inputs that the process admin defines. So when they're setting this up, think about it this way. I'll get to the next part in a second, but think about this. Like, for instance, if you wanted to do some comparison, you wanted to say dollar amount is greater than X, the process admin could be able to set a comparison number so that when it runs, that's what gets used, and they can set this from an interface. So, for instance, you may have a library item called total contract is greater than X or something, and the process admin would set up a run item. Let's call it that. We'll start calling it a run item as we go further into our talk. But it uses this library item, and it specifies an input of, say, of $100,000. So the process admin enters $100,000 as the static input item. And then when the run item itself might be called the total contract is greater than $100,000. That is what the process admin created. So it's metadata that goes into the set of instructions that the process admin can also control. Now, I would keep all of these organized into a nice, library. I would keep them organized into a nice designer folder as part of your project, but maybe a subfolder, within maybe your flows folder if you break it out that way. And I would keep all of my library items together there, knowing what they're for. They're part of this framework that's going to be exposed then through interfaces to this process admin. I'm going to go a little further with it. I would then use entities to store execution metadata. So this is a different use of entities than maybe you were used to using. Maybe entities to you mean you store records that are, process data. But what if it's part of your actual design consideration? So we have to actually persist the instructions somewhere. Both the library items and the process admin define instructions. We need to persist it. So using an entity for this, and an entity for this is perfect. Entities can be used to define a library of flows, store metadata, store the flow identifier, the flow ID that it should call, and you as the developer can build out the library. So if you look here, you think about the library item itself is developer defined, the flow itself is developer defined, the run item, as we're calling it, is process admin defined, right? It's the actual process admin configurable portion of your design. So you're letting them select a library item, configure it as needed, and then the process admin would go further by creating a sequence of these run items, in a specified order. So that's how we're using decisions metadata, or decisions entity data structures to persist metadata, and it defines how your process will run. Now, one of the most important design features in decisions that makes all of this possible, we wouldn't be here talking about this today if it didn't exist. It's a feature. So how many use subflows? Do you use subflows a lot? Has anyone noticed that if you don't use subflows and your flow gets too big, that the designer really starts to perform poorly as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It does. The use of subflows is excellent. We use it for, separating out nice little logical sections of your application, right? It makes complete sense. But I will say this, there's a feature of this step that you may have not noticed. And it's a doozy. It's a doozy. You have the selection type here. By default, it's set to pick. That's what it's set to by default. And then you would statically pick a target, right? You would actually just pick your target, which allows you to browse or create a flow and select it. That's how we're all used to using it very commonly. But did you know, if you change the selection type down to runtime selection, a new field shows up. Target ID, all right? Target ID. So this allows you to then use it for the flow ID, and it'll pass it in, and that's the flow to execute. It can be dynamic, the way this thing works. It can be dynamic. Now, that's not to say when you select this, you're still going to have to pick a static one, by the way, because the step will be very unhappy with you if you don't. You will get the mean, the validation error, right? It's going to be very unhappy with you. So you have to pick a static one and feed it that dynamic flow ID. So the flow ID, you're storing in an entity, right? You're just storing it in the database. And then when it goes to execute, it pulls it out, it feeds it in there. In runtime, it then runs that particular flow, dictated by data, not statically defined. And here's what I do. I will create a template flow as one of my library items. And I'll give it a standard input, a standard output, what all the rest of my library items are going to look like. I'll make it look like that. It's kind of a true template. And when I go to select it here, because it requires me to select one, I'll select that. And then it'll have the right inputs and outputs. And then when I drop that into the designer, the execution engine, it'll have the right outputs to work with. But then when it goes to call it, it's going to use the dynamic, right? So this is a remarkable feature. And without it, I don't think we'd be having this conversation today, frankly. So the other thing is the execution engine itself. Let's talk about it for a moment. The flow that calls flows, if you will. The execution engine, what does it do? Now you could probably simplify, you could make it more complex too. I'm showing you just a straightforward example of how I would approach something like this. It has a very simple mission in life. The first thing it does is it gets all the actions that the process admin's defined. This is just a fetch step. It's just working with an entity, right? I just stored some instructions in the database. It pulls it out. For each item, it has a for each typically, and then we would, hey, maybe I go get some additional data about the library item, maybe some metadata, et cetera, about the library item. Maybe that's where I keep the flow ID is in the library item. All right? And then it executes using that strategy we just talked about, using a run subflow. It executes whatever flow that was in that data. It then executes it. There you go. So end to end. That way. Now that subflow step, it could run synchronously, it could run asynchronously. It depends on if your typical process needs to wait. It could be either one. That could be configurable as well. We could actually have two different versions of this based upon the run item, could specify it. There's a lot of things we could do with this. So this is the basic core engine. But in here, you could have all your special considerations of how to handle certain outcomes. If it's validation, how do you handle failure versus success? Things like that. You could handle as part of this particular construct. This is the core engine that would run the sequence. All right, so let's do this. So if you start to design this way, it brings in some interesting considerations that maybe you've never really had to deal with before. In a typical environment, we have the development instance, we have the repo, we have the production instance, maybe we have a QA instance in some scenarios. You're used to moving your project around between these environments. But if you think about it, now and for the first time ever, you might have entity records, these records that are actually not just test data. Usually when an entity record is sitting on your development instance, it's just test data. It goes with the process you're testing. In this case, it's part of your configuration. So now you got to move this thing over. It's part of your construct. It's part of what production data is going to look like. So you're going to have to deal with it. So in that case, now you're going to have to associate it with your project. You're going to have to right-click on an entity record, the actual record, to say that defines a library item, all of your library items, and you're going to have to associate it with your project. So therefore it moves. So therefore it ports with your project, and it ends up in production like it's supposed to be. Just something to point out, consideration, if you're not used to designing that way. All right? So I like to do this. We have, I find real-life situations are a great way to demonstrate something like this. And I have a couple of case studies that I want to mention, just two of them today, just two case studies. These are ExpressAbility clients we've had over the last few years, and they came to us with these needs where a data-driven design was the perfect solution. And I'm going to highlight a couple of them today. The first one is a energy infrastructure company. They have more than 10,000 employees. They needed to manage requests that were coming in to their accounting staff as changes to codes that they use in their general ledger. Okay? These were being handled by ad hoc emails, very laborious. These guys were getting in these emails. They might get a spreadsheet full of codes they want to change. They have to go research each code, look in multiple systems to decide if it's okay to make this change, if it's appropriate, and then go make the change. Extremely laborious. Now, it had some very special requirements, a project like this. They needed very extensive validation, meaning they really, and some of the validation needed to occur, looking at other systems, integrated with other systems. The net purpose of the validation was to keep the requests from even being submitted if it wasn't appropriate. It was the gatekeeper right at the beginning. And they had to meet all the criteria. A certain code had to go through dozens and dozens of different types of validation in order to be allowed. And the nature of the business also required that frequent changes be made to both the validation and the review process by domain experts, you guessed it, internal accounting staff, we would call them process admins for our discussion. These are non-technical users. Because of the complexity of validation, one other thing that was interesting, their staff needed complete visibility of all of the logic of the system's current configuration, meaning these accounting staff, in this case, these process admins, needed to be able to reference exactly what was going on in the flows, under the hood, in their interfaces. They needed to see the logic because it was very complex. They needed to understand why something would fail. So they had to see it from their configuration interface. So we constructed a paradigm where, and this is an interface that is used by these accounting staff to manage the process. And it works kind of like this. They can manage both the validation process and the review process from these specially designed interfaces. This one in particular, validations are organized into what we call validation sets. And you see a set. When you click on a set, a list of validations would load. So if you click on this one, a different list is going to load. This is all one big interface you're looking at. So they would pick on one, they'd select one, and then a different list would load. And then each of these are editable on each side. You can think of it that way. Now, the thing is these sets would be triggered based on the request. So something in the request would trigger it, unless it was global, then it would run for all of them. But otherwise, something in the request would trigger it, and then if it runs, it would run all the validations inside of it in the correct order. Okay, so that's how it would work. So sets are groupings of validations. You can think of it that way. And each set runs on various conditions. Now, a validation is ultimately, guess what? A flow. It's a flow. A validation is just a flow. And, it's an entity in decisions that points to a flow as well. And that's how we built out this library. Each of these items were all part of a library that they selected for the functionality of these. I'm going to show you how it works. So the process admin would configure a run item to work a certain way, and they would use this type of interface to do it. So what you see here on the left is you can see that they have the ability to select a library item. And I kind of blew that up over here. Here's the list of library items they have available. Unless you're in accounting, you probably don't recognize all that. I certainly don't, but I know what they do. But these very industry-specific things that need to look at data a certain way. So each one of these represents a flow. And so when they would set up this particular validation in one of the sets, they would pick what library item should be ran, what sequence it should run in, what the pass message is, what the failed message is. And then we showed them a logic diagram, which is a screenshot of the actual flow. Yes, we needed to make our flows look nice. In fact, they had to be readable by a non-technical business user, right? And so we actually had to use the flow to describe what it looked like. Of course, using the decisions framework, decisions behind the scenes automatically updates these. So anytime a developer would make a change to the flow, decisions update the screenshots internally, and this interface shows it to them. So that means, as long as we put a nice explanation under every step and explain what it is, any accounting person, when they're going in and they're working with a library item and they're adding it to a validation, they can see what the library item does. And that's an important piece for sure. That meant that particular need. So some of these required inputs. Some of these did not require inputs. Some of these interfaced with other systems, these flows. Some of these did not. But at the end of the day, every one of them had a basic outcome of either pass or fail in this scenario. So it had a standardized set of outcomes. So the library item, which is another entity data type in decisions, stores that flow ID. All right? So when the execution engine component of the design goes to execute the flow, it uses the run step flow in decisions along with that runtime selection option, and it feeds the flow ID into that target ID as we discussed, and it runs it. So the result is a highly dynamic process where the business can actually call the shots. And the business can decide how the process runs, all without Studio Tab access, all without designers, all without decisions knowledge. I mean, it was the perfect way to really handle a situation where accounting staff need to manage the request process themselves. And the approach, uses this. We use this approach for both the validation, the gatekeeper piece, but we also use it for the review process. This may be something of interest to you if you have complex review processes. In this case, it's sort of a rules-based review process. Like who actually does the review is highly variable. And in this case, it kind of uses like the input of the request would decide which group or even secondary group, primary or secondary group, has to approve the request. That's one way that we handled it for them. So these were records that the accounting staff can manage. They can go in and actually set a certain code that would then trigger which groups need to review it. It's another way of using data-driven design to be highly dynamic, not just for validation, but also on the review side. So that's our first case study. I got one more for you. The second one is this. It was an aerospace manufacturing company, previously owned by GE, and they needed to manage their quality assurance processes to meet these regulatory requirements. This little organization called the FAA. I don't know if you ever heard of them, but yeah, they had this change process where they had a large committee, very large committee, and their change process had to follow a set of review phases. One or two sounds great. You would just statically lay it out. It was more than 20, and they needed to change it whenever they wanted. I'm like, wow, okay. So 20 review phases or more, I think it's up to like 25 or something, and they actually needed the ability to change it whenever they wanted. Who's they? Well, the quality control manager, non-technical user, but very focused, I'd be careful calling them non-technical. Quality control managers, they would consider themselves technical, but not with decisions and not in IT, right? So they needed the ability to add more review phases, subtract review phases, edit review phases, right? They needed complete control over how it worked, and they needed to change the individual reviewers in every review phase as well. complete management of the overall paradigm. So if you look at this, and it might be kind of an eye chart from way back, but each step here is actually a review phase listed out in an interface we built for them. It's kind of light because of the projector brightness, but you can add, you can edit it, you can remove it. This is a whole interface to allow management of it. This is an individual review phase, so we can name it, we can add the approvers. We can decide if this is like a single type of approval, meaning only one person out of this list needs to approve, or it's consensus, meaning every single person needs to complete the review and they all have to approve in order for it to move forward. Again, all configurable from this interface. They're not going into flow designers, right? They're doing it right from this interface. And then the order in which it is in the big picture of all the phases, whether it's active and whether or not escalation is enabled, right? So we have this capability. And I tell you, this approach, we were able to accommodate, think about this, an infinite number of review phases, an infinite number. And the entire process is being managed by a quality control manager without technical knowledge or need to access the Studio tab. So, in closing, just to summarize and to recap, data-driven design can equip your projects to be hyper-agile, extremely configurable. Non-technical business users can have the ability to determine how a process runs without any access to designers or the Studio tab. The decisions platform is really flexible enough to flourish in design-driven scenarios like the ones we've discussed. And you can use the entity data structures to store configurable elements. Instead of like records as part of your process, you can store configurable elements there. You can add a library of functionality. And the run subflow step allows for runtime selection by passing in a flow ID. The overall design concept we talked about today was composed of that three-legged stool. It was the configuration, the management of directive data, the instructions, the actual directive data, and then the flow that calls flows, which is an execution engine, flow itself. Now, I have a summary of this whole presentation in a PDF. So if this is something you're interested in learning more about, you can download this PDF right from my website. We have it set up here, expressability.com/decisionsdays, or you can send me an email. Feel free to. And I have this entire talk into a document that you can sit down with while you're doing some design or something. It has screenshots and all the good stuff in it. And I will say this: if you have people back home, part of your team, or that would benefit from a talk like this, because you're considering some projects maybe that would benefit from this type of design, I'm happy to represent this presentation. If you wanted to, schedule some time with me, just to do a web meeting, and I can go through the same thing with them and answer their questions that way as well. You can do that by sending me an email, or you'll see a Calendly link on that Decisions Days page as well. You can schedule a meeting right there. So I'm available. Let me know however I can help. Thanks for hanging out with me. It was fun. It was a good time. Appreciate it.